Good morning. So, a couple of you have been asking me questions about the midterm paper. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But before we get started on that, does anybody have any questions about the exam? All right, we talked a little bit about the exam last time. Does anybody have any further questions about that before we talk about the paper? Yes?
It's all in your YouTube video, right, of what you talked about?
Yeah. So just so everybody's clear as far as what it's going to cover, right? Essentially, it's going to cover everything from day one up to the period before the exam, right? So everything from Columbus and Cortez up to the surprising narrative of Olympe and Guyana. Right. So be prepared to see questions about any of those things on the exam. I will give you sample essay questions in class on Thursday. Okay, so the paper. So this first paper is going to be a close reading of a single text. Right? Where was I? Close reading of a single text. Yes, thank you. So it's going to be 4 to 5 pages long, so sort of roughly at least 1,400 words. No outside sources are permitted for this paper, right? I want this all to come from the fertile ground of your own brains. Right, so you should not be consulting sources for this. Now, what I mean by close reading is essentially close attention to patterns of detail in a text, right? Yes, Jonathan.
Was the paper not due last night?
No.
I kind of turned mine in, and can you like...
Let's treat it as a draft then. Okay. We'll treat it as a draft. I'll look it over for you and get back to you about it. No, the paper is due 2 weeks from today.
Because I seen the syllabus, it said the 19th, so just assume that it...
Is that what it says on the syllabus? Oh no, that's the date. That's today's date right there because I'm going to be talking about it today. Yeah, no, that's just date on which I modified the document. No, due date is right here in bold. Tuesday, October 4th. Yeah, that's when it's due. It is not due tonight. Okay, so, close reading. Essentially what you're going to do is pay close attention to some pattern of detail in a single text that you think adds up to some important theme or idea, right? So say you notice a particular attitude towards friendship in Tartuffe, right? Or you want to look at sort of like the rhetoric of violence in Orinoco or something like that, the sorts of things that violence is used to signify, right? Some sort of important pattern that you think adds up to the text's meaning in some way. And what we're going to do is then make an argument about why that particular pattern of details matters, right? What does it mean? Why does it matter? One thing I am going to insist that, well, you know, I'll cover that in a moment. We'll worry about that a little bit later. But yeah, the paper is going to be due Tuesday, October 4th. And I am willing to look at drafts up to 48 hours before the due date, right? So if you get something to me by the 2nd, I promise I will look at it. If you get something to me after the 2nd, I will look at it if I have time. But I can't guarantee that I will. Also, I do give extra credit for going to the writing center. So if you take your draft to the writing center and talk to a tutor there, you will get a bump of half a letter grade. So, right, your B plus paper becomes an A minus, your C plus paper becomes a B minus, so on and so forth, right? So it is well worth your time, well worth the time and effort to go and do that. And, you know, you'll have a better paper anyway.
Do you get
notification if we go there, or do we have to turn in like a sheet of paper?
Usually they automatically notify me. Just make sure you remind them that they have to do so, because sometimes they forget. But yeah, they'll send me an email that says, you know, Lindsay came to the writing center and we talked about blah 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 and everything was peachy, right? So as long as I get that email, you'll get the points. Okay, any other questions just sort of about the broad task here? Yes, Melandria.
How many times do you have to go to the writing center? Just once?
You only get the points for going once. You can go more. You can go more than once. And I would suggest, like, if you really want to do well on the paper, it's probably not a bad idea to go more than once. But you will only get the extra points for going once, right? I'm not going to give you extra points for every time you go, right? The extra points are just a carrot to get you in the door. Anything else?
Does this include like how like the exam includes everything from day one till?
Yeah, I would say you can write on anything up to a lot of Equiano, but I would probably encourage you to maybe not wait that long to get started, right? So probably work on something that we've already talked about, right? One of the reasons I'm telling you about this now is so that you have time to actually get your project underway and get help with it if you need it. So it's probably good to focus on something that we've already read. If you really, really, really want to write about Rousseau or Equiano, go for it. But I'd suggest something that we did earlier. And if you really like Rousseau or you really like a lot of Equiano, save that for the final paper. Any other questions? Yes, Megan.
Is it 3 to 5 pages or the 4 to 5?
It's 4 to 5. Yeah, where does it say 3 to 5?
Okay, come on.
Oh, nowhere? I was like, oh shit, do I have to fix something? We all commit typos. But yeah, it's 4 to 5 pages. And please, 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 it must be submitted in 12-point Times New Roman font. Okay, please do not mess around with funny fonts. Please keep everything a standard size. Right? It makes it much easier to read, and it makes it much easier for me to sort of, judge how much space you've used on the page. Microsoft Word has this annoying default that puts spaces between paragraphs. I would like you to turn that off. All you have to do so is go up to this little line spacing icon up here, click on it, and if it says add space after paragraph, you're fine. If it says remove space after paragraph, click remove space after paragraph, and that'll get rid of those annoying extra spaces. The paper does have to be double spaced, right? And by no spaces between paragraphs, I don't mean sandwich the paragraphs together, right? Don't squish them on top of each other. Just try to turn off that extra spacing feature. Use normal standard MS Word margins. Please do not make your margins wider, wider, wider. Right, look, I am a good bit older than you are, but, it was not, within living memory, I was in your position, right? Back when gas was under $1. And I would sometimes try little funny tricks, I'd make the font just a little bit bigger, I'd make the margins just a little bit wider, the spacing just a little bit wider, to try to make my professors think that my paper was longer than it really was. And you know what? It never worked. Because they had tried to do the same things on typewriters when they were students, so they recognized the tricks, right? Generation after generation of students tries to do this and fails, because we've all been there. So, right, just don't try it, is the basic message here, right? Okay, notation should be MLA style, parenthetical, with a works cited page at the end. You're only quoting from one text, right? You're only quoting from whatever it is you're writing about. But I do still want to see that works cited page at the end. And no, the works cited page does not count towards your 4 to 5 pages. Yes, Jonathan.
Like, I forgot. I'm gonna say it after.
Okay, if it comes back to you, then just feel free to raise your hand. So, does everybody understand what I mean by parenthetical notation? So, author, last name, page number, right? So if you're writing about Orinoco, right, then 324 after the quotation. Yes, Jonathan?
You said no outside sources. So can we use the stuff that we learned in class about the text?
You can use information that you learned that we discussed in class, yes. If you want to like develop a theme that we've talked about in class, that's fine. But make sure you're adding something to it, right? Make sure that you're not just sort of repeating back things that we've already talked about. Yes, Sarah?
Can we take information from the other text that we read too? Because you said one text. Does that mean strictly one text?
I only want you quoting from one text and paying attention, paying close attention to one text in this particular paper, right? Now, when we do the research paper later in the term, that's going to require you to pull information from a variety of sources. But yeah, for this paper, I want you to stick to one text. And I do want you, I know like most of you are not English majors, some of you are, which is good, yay, good for you. But in other disciplines, I know you're often used to paraphrasing or summarizing when you are quoting from, when you're taking language from a text. In English, by and large, we don't do that, right? You are expected to quote the source directly. So at the end of the quote, right, parenthetical notation, then period. Right, I do expect direct quotes. However, I do have a personal pet peeve that I call the floating quote. This is when you just dump a quote into a paragraph with no real setup and no real explanation as to why it's there, and then pretend that its meaning is self-evident, right? It's probably not self-evident, right? I'm not going to understand what the hell you're doing with that quote. So what you need to do is set it up in your own language in some way, right? So, as Ben demonstrates in Orinoco, comma, quote, citation. Or, we see an example of this in Tartuffe, quote, citation, right? Just make sure that your quotes are hooked up to your own sentences in some way. In some, that you're signaling when you're about to quote, basically. 4 to 5 pages does mean 4 to 5 pages. It does not mean 3 pages, nor does it mean 3.5, right? I expect at least a full 4 pages. And if you find yourself going over 5 pages, you're probably working with an idea that's too big for the assignment. And you might want to narrow things down and maybe get a little bit more specific. Right, so 4 to 5 pages, I really want you to stick within those limits. Finally, the paper must be uploaded to the Dropbox in Georgia View by 11:59 p.m. on the due date. Right, so this way nobody's quibbling about when midnight is or is not. Right, 11:59, that's when it's due, on October 4th. Okay, so any questions about any of this stuff? Yeah, James.
On the works cited page at the end, do you want us to cite the author from the particular story we used?
Yes.
Okay.
Be specific. Yep. I used this volume of the anthology, right? Cite the particular author and the page numbers the text occurs on, and all that sort of thing, right? If you don't know how to do that, come talk to me. But there is actually a really good website that can show you, teach you basically everything you need to know about citation. If you just go to the Purdue Online Writing Lab, just do a search on Purdue OWL MLA citation.
Oh yeah, I've been using that for years.
Yeah.
It's the best thing ever. It helps.
Let's click on that. And this will tell you anything you need to know, really, about citation. It'll tell you how to cite any type of source and stick within the MLA rules. All right, any other questions about this stuff? Just the basic rules of the assignment. Okay, one more thing I do want to remind everybody of, right? The penalty for plagiarism, first time it happens in this class, is a 0 on the assignment. Now this is a pretty big assignment, right? This is worth a lot of points. So you really can't afford a 0 on it. Second time you're caught plagiarizing something, that's failure of the course. So let me just give everybody a quick rundown of the sorts of things I consider plagiarism, so that we're all clear on what that means and everybody avoids it. Okay, so first off, most obvious form of plagiarism. Where the hell is my marker? Right? Direct borrowing from another source without attribution. Right? You just lift language and ideas directly from something you found on the web or from a book you read or what have you without citing any of it and present it as your own work, right? That's the most obvious and probably morally egregious form of plagiarism. Right? This is basically theft. Second, using work you've done for another class without permission of both instructors. So if you have work for if you have work you've done for another class, even if your intent is to revise it, if you want to submit it for this class, you need to first let me know that's what you're doing and ask if it's okay with me. And you need to clear it with the professor for the other class, right? So don't, submit, oh, I wrote a paper on Tartuffe in high school, I'll just resubmit that. No, that's not going to fly, right? That's not going to cut it. Third, rewording of other people's ideas without citation or attribution. You shouldn't be using outside sources for this paper anyway. And going online, going to say SparkNotes or Schmoop.com or whatever, and just rewording something you find there, right? You can't do that. That does count as plagiarism, even if you do put it into your own words. Okay, so any questions about plagiarism penalties, about what constitutes plagiarism for this assignment? Okay, we're all good, we're all clear? All right, then just two more things I want to talk about here. And this refers to the way you're going to be graded, right? The things that I'm most interested in seeing on your papers. Right? The most important thing is originality, right? The most important thing is that you have a good original idea for which you provide sufficient evidence and which you argue for well. Right, so one thing, the first thing you need to do is make absolutely 100% sure that the idea you've come up with is arguable. Right? Is this something that someone else could potentially disagree with, looking at the same evidence a different way? Right? If it's not arguable, then all you're going to be giving me basically is a summary, right? So it has to be something that someone else could potentially disagree with. So I'm not really interested in whether it's true or false. I'm not really interested in sort of what sort of question. You don't have to tell me what happens in a text, right? I know what happens. I read it, I assigned it. So what you ought to focus on instead is a kind of how or why question, right? How does this particular pattern work in the text? Why is this weird thing there? Those are the sorts of questions you should be trying to answer. Also, your thesis should be rooted again in concrete observation of detail, right? Try not to get into fuzzy emotional impressions, right? Your feelings, it's not that I don't care about your feelings or that I actively want to hurt your feelings. It's that, like, for the purposes of this paper, right, they're going to get in the way of objective analysis. So if you are feeling particularly strongly about something, right, if a text makes you feel particularly angry or disgusted or fearful, try to find something concrete in the text, right? Some kind of pattern or detail that is making you feel that way. And use that as the starting point for your analysis. Okay, so any questions about this thus far? I will say too, as far as originality is concerned, right, I'm going to give you more credit for going out on a limb and coming up with an interesting but plausible idea than for playing it safe, right? So try to surprise me, but make sure it's actually rooted in something in the text, right? Okay, second thing, clarity is important, right? I'm not the grammar police. I'm not going to go through your paper, parsing your spelling, and taking points off if you end a sentence with a preposition or any other such bullshit rules that are really style choices and not actually rules, right? But I do have to be able to understand what you wrote, right? You could have the most brilliant ideas about literature on the planet, but if you can't communicate them clearly to me, I'm not going to have any idea what you're talking about, right? So you need to make sure your paper is written in such a way as to help an audience understand it. Right? So try to avoid glaring grammatical errors. Try not to write overly complex, convoluted sentences, and try to tone the vocabulary down as well a little bit, right? Oftentimes, a 2-cent word is going to be more appropriate than a 10-cent word. So don't use the 10-cent word just to demonstrate that you know the 10-cent word. Right? If the 2-cent word is more appropriate, use that one. Also, make sure your paper is organized in a way that makes sense to a reader who cannot read your mind, right? Because I cannot. You know what you're trying to communicate. You know what you're trying to say. But I don't until I've read your paper. So each paragraph should begin with a little mini thesis, right? A topic sentence explaining the idea you intend to work with in that paragraph. And then the paragraph should stick to that single idea, right? Each paragraph should focus on one idea. If you find yourself writing really long paragraphs, you're probably ignoring this rule, right? You're probably trying to do too much in a single paragraph and need to find a place to break it up. Also, place ideas that are related to each other next to each other, right? There should be a kind of natural progression of ideas from idea to idea to idea. Don't just sort of jump around haphazardly. And finally, whenever you use a piece of evidence, always make sure you explain your interpretation of it, right? Why does it mean what you think it means? The relationship between the evidence and your interpretation is not always as obvious as we like to think it is. So, to help you out with this, there's a philosopher of language. His name is Stephen Toulmin, and he came up with what he called the Toulmin, what's called the Toulmin model of argumentation. Basically, what Toulmin is demonstrating is that any claim you make has to be backed up with evidence, and there has to be some reason why that evidence backs up your claim. Right? So, in the simplest level, it works in 3 parts. So the claim I'm trying to make, not clam, is I am a US citizen. The data that I use to back this up, I was born in Pennsylvania. How does the fact that I'm born in Pennsylvania justify my claim that I'm a US citizen?
Because if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen.
Yeah, Pennsylvania's the United States. If you're born on US soil, you're a citizen. Yes. So my warrant, right, the link between the data and the claim is, right, that anyone born on US soil is a citizen. So just make sure that whenever you are providing an interpretation of some piece of evidence, you're always including that warrant, right? You're always explaining to me why you've interpreted it the way you have. Okay, does anybody, I know this is a lot, does anybody have any questions about this, about any of this? Yeah, Casey.
If we chose to write on an idea that we wrote on in our daily writings, would that be considered plagiarism?
No, that's fine. In fact, that's one of the things I want you to try to use the in-class writings for, right? If you had a good idea that you want to develop further, that's absolutely fine. You can certainly try to develop that into a longer paper. Yeah, I'm sorry, Sarah, you had a question?
It's not about the paper, but on the midterm, Equiano is going to be on it, and then we're going to talk about it Thursday after.
No, you weren't here last Thursday, right? Okay, when we talked about this, we actually moved the midterm to Thursday. So yes, you've got an extra day to sweat and freak out about it. Anything else? Okay. Then let's talk about revolution. All right. So how'd this go for you? What'd you think? Anybody have any observations, thoughts, questions?
That was interesting.
Okay.
I like that in the U.S. Declaration of Independence that he said that, do you want me to read it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed.
Okay.
So I thought that, I took it to mean that people get comfortable in their society and are, too afraid to separate themselves if things are going wrong. But it's a must sometimes, to get out of the comfort zone and separate yourself.
Sure.
Especially if there's evil and suffering going on.
And what the framers of the Declaration are doing here is, well, they're actually operating within a rhetorical tradition. Right now, they're suggesting that changes of governments are basically rare things, right? That we don't throw over the system lightly, right? We only do it when things become intolerable. However, at least twice in the previous century, right? Remember, this is still 1776, right? This is the very beginning of the Revolution. So how do most American colonists still see themselves as what? Do they see themselves yet as Americans necessarily? They're still technically legally British subjects, right? And twice in the previous century, once in the 1640s and once in the 1680s, what have the British done?
Trying to overthrow the government, didn't they?
Yeah. twice they deposed a king. Right? First Charles I, and then his younger son, James II. Now, both times, parliaments, which in sort of the British system existed basically to be a balance to the power of a balance against the power of the monarch, issued a declaration which listed in detail the abuses the king had committed in order to make this course of action necessary. Right? So, because the king has done this and this and this and this to us, it becomes necessary for him to be overthrown. And if we look at most of the Declaration of Independence is taken up by this list of grievances against George III, right? This is the bulk of the document. If we look on page 19 here, why don't we try something? Why don't we just go around the room? We'll start with Kiba, and from he has refused his assent to laws, right? Just each of you go around and read one of these articles.
He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the good purpose.
He has forbidden the governor to pass laws of immediate or special importance unless suspended in their operation until his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he is utterly neglected to attend to them.
He has refused to pass other laws for accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only.
He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures.
Macy, go ahead.
He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with making firmness his invasions on the rights of the people.
He has refused for a long time as such dissolution to cause others to be elected whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their excuse, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all dangers of invasion from them without convulsions within.
He has desired to prevent the population of these states. For that purpose, obstruction the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass order to encourage their migration hither and raising the conditions of new
Appropriations.
appropriation plan.
He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing the judiciary power.
He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries.
He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance.
He has kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislature.
He has effectively rendered the military independent of and superior to the civil power.
Jonathan,
Just
yep.
combined with others, the subject of the jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, given the assent to their acts of intended legislation. For the ordering large bodies of armed troops among us, the protection them by a mock trial, for punishment for any murders which they could commit in an inhabitant of this states, by cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without the consent for depriving us in many cases of benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried to pretend offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in the neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it an example and it instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamental reforms of our governments, for suspending our own legislators and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whosoever.
He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us.
He has plundered our seas, ravished our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people.
He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation.
Okay, and then the last two are sort of very specific grievances that refer to particular policies. What do you notice running through these complaints? What is the basic problem the colonists have with the rule of George III? Why is he no longer worthy to rule them?
Because he didn't do it.
I'm sorry, one at a time. So you say because he doesn't care about them. What did you say, Jonathan?
Because he treated them unjustly in their opinion.
Yeah, he's treated them unjustly in their opinion, right? Unjustly as what? What should they be treated just like?
The citizens back in England.
They should be treated like other British subjects, right? And what they're arguing is that he has not done so, right? He has not put them on an equal level. He has not given them the rights due to other British subjects. Now, I'm using the word subjects here for a specific reason. They'll become clear in a moment, right? But a lot of the things he's accused of, right, smack more of dereliction of duty than anything active that he's done, right? It's he has not done this, he has not done this, he has not done this. He's neglected to do this, he's abdicated this particular responsibility, right? That sort of thing. So, rather than a positive assertion of rights, what we have in the U.S. Declaration is a complaint about the denial of rights they feel they're due, right? They're not necessarily arguing for any new rights that anyone should have. I said, no, we're being denied the rights that are our due as British subjects. We're not being permitted to exercise them in the way other Britons are. There is something here, though, that this has in like. What did you notice most of these declaration documents begin with? How do they start? What's that? Okay, he. There's a lot of he language, yes. The citizen or subject in most of these cases is referred to using the male pronoun almost exclusively. And that's something that Olympe de Gouges goes over in her parody of the French Declaration. What else is going on at the beginning of most of these? Let's start, just again with the U.S. Declaration here, right? When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Do you notice any particular language here that also runs through these other declarations? Any things that they all seem to reference?
There's a repetition of the laws of nature and reason.
Yeah. Good. Right, this is an idea that is kind of specific to the Enlightenment. The idea that there are natural laws, right? There are rules according to which the world works. There are certain natural rights that are due to all human beings as a result. So these laws of nature are treated, right, as universal and as a kind of justification it's okay, for the abolishment of some of the more arbitrary forms of government. Now, I think we may have talked about this a little bit in previous sessions. Does anybody know anything about social contract theory? What's a social contract?
The government's used to uphold the law of nature for their citizens, something like that.
It is basically a kind of agreement between the governed and the governing body, right? This is a body of theory that really starts to develop in the 17th century. Right? The earliest iteration we have of this is by a guy by the name of Thomas Hobbes, who writes a book after the English Civil War called Leviathan, which is very, very long and very, very dense, and written with all the linguistic flourishes common to 17th century prose. So Hobbes' theory basically is that people give up certain rights to the government in exchange for protection of property. Right, so according to Hobbes, essentially, you give up your right to use violence to defend your personal property to a government, which is then supposed to fulfill that function for you, right? So you're not supposed to just go shooting anybody who steps on your land, right? It's the government's job, in Hobbes' model, to punish that person when they transgress against you. And yet you give up your right to blast them. Now, John Locke, the empiricist philosopher, slightly later comes up with a different idea of how social contract theory is supposed to work. The government doesn't take rights from the people in exchange for security. What it does is protect the rights of the people. The government's natural and legitimate function is to prevent the natural rights of the people from being trampled on and abused. And if a government ceases to do this, if a government fails to protect the rights of the people, then the people have a right to dissolve the contract and overturn that government. So in these different versions of social contract theory, there's a third one we'll get to in a moment, we have the beginnings of small c conservatism in Hobbes and small l liberalism in Locke. Right? When we're talking about historical political theory, conservative and liberal don't really mean the same things that we usually take them to mean in American discourse. Right? We've taken these words and essentially shoehorned them into meanings they weren't originally intended to serve. conservatism traditionally is about the defense of traditional privileges and the defense of private property, whereas liberalism is concerned with the defense of personal freedoms. So classical liberalism of John Locke's variety would probably look a little bit more like what we would call libertarianism.
Yeah, I was about to ask that.
Yeah. Now, the Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau throws a third idea into the mix, that in fact government is an expression of the general will. Right? That is the will of the majority of the people. And a government that is not in accordance with the will of the governed, again, should be overturned, overthrown. Now, to return to this idea of people as subjects, what does it mean to be a subject?
You're loyal to a ruler, a group of rulers.
Okay, it implies a certain sense of loyalty, right? What is the basis for that loyalty? Why? What makes you, for example, a subject of the King of France?
You're subjected to his role and
Okay,
like
yeah.
everything.
Essentially, yeah, right. You are a subject of the King of France if you are born in France, and you have to follow the dictates set by the king, right? So a subject doesn't necessarily have rights. A subject has duties. If you're a subject, there are things that you have to do, things that you're required to do. Largely because of where you happen to be born, right? Where you happen to live. And are all subjects in a kingdom typically treated equally? People of higher birth get privileges that people of lower birth do not, right? So what starts to emerge out of social contract theory, and it's not quite there yet in 1776 when the Declaration of Independence is written, right? What they're complaining about is the king's abuse of his subjects, right? His abuse of his power over them. What we see coming out in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is the definition of a new kind of relationship between people and their governments, right? A citizen does not simply owe arbitrary loyalty to a state, right? Does not simply have to obey the dictates of a ruler. A citizen has rights. The government is expected to behave a certain way towards a citizen. It's a more reciprocal relationship that comes out of this social contract theory, right? That it's not just one way. One thing that all three of these theories have in common, as different as they are, is that the ruler can't rule without the consent of the governed, right? The people have to give their assent to the ruler in order for the ruler to have any power. In fact, that's the central image in Hobbes's Leviathan, right? Is the body of the ruler. He's sort of playing on that old two bodies of the king idea, right? Where the body of the ruler, the body of the state, is made up of all the people. So let's look on page 21 at the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. the representatives of the French people organized in National Assembly, considering that ignorance, forgetfulness, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole causes of the public miseries and of the corruption of governments, have resolved to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of man, in order that this declaration, being ever present to all the members of the social body, may unceasingly remind them of their rights and their duties, in order that the acts of the legislative power and those of the executive power may be each moment compared with the aim of every political institution, and thereby may be more respected, and in order that the demands of the citizens, grounded henceforth upon simple and incontestable principles, may always take the direction of maintaining the Constitution and the welfare of all. How can we already see this is taking a different course from the American Declaration of Independence? What's different here? What's being positively asserted here that is not positively asserted in the American Declaration?
That the people need to be loyal to the government, or I don't know, maybe I'm
Well, what was the, if we look at, for example, what the bulk of the Declaration of Independence is made up of, right? It's that long list of grievances, right? It's a justification for rebellion, but is there anywhere a real positive assertion that people are citizens and not subjects? They do seem to believe, the framers of the Declaration do seem to believe that subjects who have been mistreated have the right to throw a government over, right? But they make no real assertions as to what the positive rights of a citizen are. Now, some of that is because the purpose of the document is a little bit different, right? And it's operating in a slightly different tradition. The American Declaration is in that tradition of those British depose the monarch declarations, right? These are the reasons why we have to do this. The French Declaration really kind of is something new altogether. On the one hand, right, we don't have a breakaway group of colonists rebelling against royal power. What we have is a bunch of mostly middle-class people who have decided that the current government, the current social situation, the current political situation in France is intolerable. And they're trying to remake the state, basically, right? They're trying to remake the French state with people as citizens, with positive rights, rather than as subjects. So, does anybody remember how the theory of the three estates worked in France? What were the three estates? What was this theory concerned with? What was it describing? If we think back to Descartes and to Molière, what does this three estates theory describe? What are they? It's something that goes back to the Middle Ages. It's a breakdown of social classes, right? The first estate, those who pray, clergy. Second estate, those who fight, aristocracy, right? That was the original function of an aristocracy. They were warriors. Third estate, those who work. Which basically means everybody who's not a clergyman or a noble, right? So you had a situation where all of the privileges went to the smallest groups of the population, and the vast body of humanity was just kind of completely undifferentiated. So when they start making their positive assertions of right, the third estate dominates the writing of this declaration. Right. In consequence, page 22, the National Assembly recognizes and declares, in the presence and under the auspices of the Supreme Being, the following rights of man and citizen. 1. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be based only upon public utility. So why do they start with it? Why is this the first assertion of rights here? What are they attacking directly? Social, go ahead, sorry.
Social classes?
Yeah, they're going right after the whole three estates idea, right? The idea that because of birth, or because someone happens to have gone into the church, they should have privileges that other people do not, right? No. Any social distinction, they're not saying social distinctions shouldn't exist, right? They're not calling for like a form of communism here. What they are saying here is that social distinctions should only be made where they're useful, right? Based on people's basic functions. Essentially, you can't lump us all in to this third estate category that doesn't really mean anything. The aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Now, what are they drawing directly on here in order to make this second statement? Whose influence that we've talked about maybe sometime in the last 15 minutes is clearly felt on this particular statement?
Enlightenment theory.
Yeah, it's this Enlightenment social contract theory, right? Particularly, in this particular case, John Locke, right? The idea that government is the protector of the rights of people. It guarantees the people's rights. It doesn't take them away. The source of all sovereignty is essentially in the nation. No body, no individual can exercise authority that does not proceed from it in plain terms. And number 6, down a little further, right? Law is the expression of the general will. So they're drawing there also on Rousseau's social theory. 1, the government guarantees our rights. 2, the government must be obedient to the will of the nation, to the general will. Now, I want to point briefly as well to Codicil 4 here, right? Liberty consists in the power to do anything that does not injure others. Why do you think they take the time to define liberty in this way? Why do they bother to define liberty at all? Say, you're writing a paper and there's a term you want to use and you feel you need to define it for your reader. Why do you need to define the term for your reader?
They truly don't. They might not know what it means, or
Yeah,
it might be new to them.
Yeah, your reader may know, may even know what the general use of the term means, right? But you might be using it in a way that is unfamiliar to them. That's what's going on here. Right. The word liberty comes from the Latin liber, which means free. And all liberty meant originally was that you were not a slave. Right? Liberty wasn't necessarily a sort of positive right. It simply described your state of being, right? If you were a person who is not a slave, you are at liberty. So they're redefining liberty in the way that we have come to understand it. But what we need to realize is that our definition of liberty is a product of these revolutionary movements influenced by the Enlightenment at the end of the 18th century, right? They're defining this because it's a new way of talking about liberty. It's a new way of thinking about the idea of liberty as a kind of as personal freedom. Essentially, freedom to do anything that does not injure others. Right? This is by and large the way we understand the term now. But they're defining it here in these clear terms because that's not the way it would have been understood if they just said, you have the right to liberty. Now, why else might they be making this distinction clear? What's one of the issues that they don't tackle in this Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen? Who is it not clear they're including in this universal brotherhood of man? Women for one, and who else? Pardon?
Slaves.
Yeah, women and slaves. In all of its talk of universal brotherhood, it does not say anything about the positive rights of women, and it does not say anything about the status of France's participation in the transatlantic slave trade or France's profits from slave labor. Right? The biggest, most profitable French colony at the time would have been the island colony of Saint-Domingue, which we know now as Haiti. Haiti was a hugely profitable colony. Saint-Domingue, sorry, was a hugely profitable colony for the French. Right? Tobacco, sugar, rum.
Cotton.
Pardon?
You said cotton, I think.
Cotton? Yeah, I don't. Did they grow cotton? I don't know. I'm not sure if the. Yeah, I don't think the conditions are right for growing cotton. I think one, you need more land, and two, I think it's too wet. But yeah, all of these consumable luxury goods that people really depended on in Europe, or the people really got a lot of pleasure and were very profitable in Europe, were produced in Haiti. Right? Sugar especially. Sugar was huge. So, because a lot of these guys who were writing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, right, were themselves, right, this definition of those who work is very, very broad. So a lot of these guys are bankers and merchants whose livelihoods depend on maintaining these colonies, on maintaining this distinction between definitions of liberty. Now, we'll get to the Dessalines Declaration in a moment, which seems probably the most strikingly different of the four, yes, more or less, for, again, reasons we'll discuss. But let's also let's not skate by the Olympe de Gouges piece as well. Like, what is she doing in her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Citizen? Where does she take most of the language from? How much of this is original to her?
The parody of the French Declaration.
Yeah, it's pure parody, right? And much of what she's doing is copying language directly from the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen and inserting woman into the definition of citizen. Right? That the citizen is not just a male French person. The citizen can also be a female French person. If we look at her preamble on page 24, mothers, daughters, sisters, representatives of the nation demand to be constituted into a national assembly, considering that ignorance, forgetfulness, or contempt of the rights of the woman are the sole causes of public miseries and of the corruption of governments, have resolved to set forth in solemn declaration the natural and inalienable and sacred rights of the woman, in order that this declaration, being ever present to all members of the social body, may unceasingly remind them of their rights and duties, in order that the acts of the power of women and those of the power of men may at each moment be compared with the aim of all political institutions and thereby be more respected, in order that the demands of women citizens, henceforth founded on simple and incontestable principles, may always turn to maintaining the Constitution, good mores, and the happiness of all. Now she makes a point of including that ignorance, forgetfulness, and contempt line, right? Which appears in the original declaration. Now they were talking about the king and the king's ministers. De Gouges is turning around and talking about the men in the National Assembly themselves. It's like, yeah, before you go pointing fingers at the king and at the aristocracy, right, take a good look in the mirror, because they are not the only ones who are ignorant, forgetful, and contemptuous, right? You too have left out large numbers of people in your declaration of what makes one a citizen. Now, I think the most important paragraph in her declaration is the last one on page 28. I take up my text concerning mores. Can I get a volunteer to read this?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Sarah, go for it.
I take up my text concerning mores. Marriage is the tomb of confidence and love. The married woman can with impunity give bastards to her husband and fortune which does not belong to them. The unmarried one has but one weak right. The old and inhuman laws refused her and her children this right in the name of property of the father. And no new laws have been made on this subject. If an attempt to give an honorable and just place to my sex is, at this moment, considered as a paradox on my part and as attempting the impossible, I leave to future men the glory of treating the subject. But in the meanwhile, it can be prepared through national education by restoring customs and conjugal conventions.
Okay, so what is the central issue in this paragraph? What is her complaint? What does this have to do with?
Marriage.
Okay, yeah, marriage. Marriage. Ooh, that blessed arrangement. What about marriage is she concerned with?
Inheritance laws.
Partially, right? Is it really marriage that she's talking about?
It's like, is she talking about like kind of she's stuck after she got married? Or like, and the woman had no like power in the relationship, they didn't have any land, they were just 100% relying on the man to provide for them?
Well, when she talks about married women giving bastards to their husbands, what does she mean? What protection does a married woman have if she has children out of wedlock?
She has none.
What's that?
She has none.
Well, if the husband doesn't know, they're not out of wedlock, right? Doesn't exist. So if a married woman can deceive her husband into thinking that children that she has conceived out of wedlock are in fact his, she gets away scot-free. What happens to the unmarried mother?
About 1 week, right?
The unmarried one has but one weak right. The old and inhuman laws refuse her and her children this right in the name and property of the father, and no new laws have been made on this subject.
There's no inheritance or anything.
Yeah, they are talking about inheritance, right? That her children have no right to inheritance, right? So essentially, who is not required to do anything about them or take care of them? The father, yeah. The man is exempt from any responsibility for illegitimate children that he fathers. It's placed all on the back of the woman. And she's using this as an example to illustrate the legal disparity that remains even after this, the revolution and the Declaration of Rights and all that, between men and women. That this is something that have not been rectified, right? That they're both involved in the situation, right? It took both of them, but the woman is stuck with the consequences and has no legal recourse, while the man gets to go on as though nothing's ever happened. All right, are we, where are we for time? 12:11, okay. So we are not going to have time to look at the Dessalines, which is too bad because it is interesting and weird. So I'm going to give you the reading questions for Rousseau for next time. And I will have sample exam questions to pass out to you on Thursday.